Today, I've got an Azure project for you, and it involves serverless. So few of you saw that I built a serverless QR code generator, but that was in AWS. And today, we'll be rebuilding it in Azure. So I'll be using Azure Functions, Azure Storage, and I also want to build a front end which will utilize the Azure function as an API. So let's build it. If you're new to the channel, hi, I'm Rishabh, and this is Rishabh in Cloud. So let's get started with this project. Before we get started, here are some prerequisites that you need to have installed because we'll be using it. So the first one is the Azure CLI, also the Azure command line interface, which allows you to deploy and interact with Azure using your CLI. The second one is the Azure Functions core tools. The Azure Functions core tools allow you to develop Azure functions locally and test them before you can deploy them to Azure. And the third one is, since I'll be using JavaScript today, make sure you have node.js installed. So with prerequisites out of the way, let's get started. So first of all, I want to make sure that I'm in the right directory, and I want to create a directory for my project. So here I'm creating a directory called Azure QR Code, and let's change our directory to our project directory that we just created. So now we'll use the Azure Function Core Tool CLI to create a boilerplate function in JavaScript. And you can do that by doing func, which stands for function, init space QR code generator, or whatever the name of the Azure function you want to give, and then space -- JavaScript, or Python, or any other language you want to use for Azure Functions. Make sure you check out what other languages are supported by Azure Functions. Hit enter, and there we go. So if I take a look at my directory now, you'll see that it created the QR code generator directory. And if we cd into that and list the files now, you can see there were certain Azure function files that were created. Again, this is just a boilerplate functions directory. Now, the next thing I want to do is create an HTTP trigger, and I'll discuss why we want that. So in order to create an HTTP trigger, you can type in function space new -- name, generate QR code, which will be the trigger endpoint, and then template will use HTTP trigger. And you can look up Azure Functions documentation on what all available triggers are. And then the authentication level, I want to keep it anonymous so that people can use this API endpoint to test out my QR code generator. And if we hit enter, it'll give us an HTTP trigger. Again, remember, I'm running this in the QR code generator directory. So now let's go one directory back, which was the Azure-QR code, where all of the code will reside, and open VS Code. Okay, so I have my VS Code here, and you'll see me vanish now because I don't want to take the screen and hide important details because it has happened in the past. Now, if we look at our directory structure on the right-hand side, you can see this was the functions folder that was created when we did func init. And then this was the HTTP trigger that was created for us. So we have index.js. And this is just a boilerplate HTTP trigger that returns your name if you pass that as a parameter. So we'll change this file to generate a QR code. Before we do that, there are some required libraries that we need to install. So let's open our terminal here, and you can do that in VS Code, so you don't have to open the terminal app itself. So now that I have my integrated terminal here, make sure I am in the functions directory, which is QR code generator. And let's do npm install. So the first one is QR code, which, as you can predict, will help us generate the QR code itself. And the second one is the Azure storage blob. And you might be able to guess because that is where we'll store our QR codes. So this will install the npm dependency QR code and the storage blob. It might take some time to install them. While that happens, I want to quickly show you that I've created the Azure storage. So if I go to my Azure account here, here's the QR code generator 7, which is the storage account. As you can see on my screen, I'll zoom in a little bit. So I've created a resource group, which is called QR-code-generator-rg. And this is where all the resources we need for this project will reside. And I have the QR code generator 7 as the storage account. Again, I just did it with some ClickOps, because that's a term. So ClickOps basically mean that I went through the portal, looked up storage account and created it. And then what I also did is created a QR-codes container, and we'll be using this container to store all the QR codes that are generated by our Azure function. Coming back to the VS Code, we can see that the npm install has ran, and we have the QR code and the Azure Storage Blob installed. So now it's time to modify our HTTP trigger. So let's get rid of the entire code in index.js under generate QR code. And now I'll go through the code as blocks. So I'll not bore you by typing each line, but instead write the code, few blocks, and then explain what happens. Okay, so for the first, we are gonna make sure that we are using the correct libraries and we are initiating them. So you can see that here we will be using the QR code library, and we are also requiring the storage-blob, which is where we'll store these QR codes. And then also, in order to connect our Azure function to the storage, we'll be using a connection string, which I'll go over here shortly. Next, we are creating a function here, and we are logging that we're starting to generate a QR code. In the next line, I'm looking for a URL in either the query parameter or the body of the request that will be made through HTTP. But if URL doesn't exist, I want it to respond with a status code of 400 and say that please pass a URL on the query string or in the request body, since we'll be using this QR code generator against the URLs that the users provide. Next, I'm using a try block, and here we'll generate the QR code itself. So we are using the QR code library and writing the URL data to that QR code here. After that, we are uploading it to Azure Blob Storage. So you can see that I'm starting the Blob service client here, and we are using the connection string. The container name, as I showed you in the beginning, is QR-codes. Again, you can store this in an environment variable just like we did with the storage connection string. For now, I have it hard-coded here. And then we are creating a container client. So this will allow us to connect to the container, which is the QR-codes. And if it doesn't exist, we want it to create that container client. So in the next two lines, what I'm doing is I'm using regex to remove the HTTPS : / from the URL itself. And the reason is I want the name in the container for the QR code image to look clean. So that's why we are using regex here. In the next 4 lines, I'm basically uploading a base64 encoded data, which means it's an image to Azure storage. So the first line is pretty explanatory because it's creating a blob client from the container client using the blob name. The container client is an instance of Azure's blob service client that allows you to interact with Azure Blob Storage. In the second line, it uses regular expression, regex again, to parse the QR code data, which is to be a base64 encoded string. The regular expression is designed to match the format of a data URL. The match operation returns an array where the second element is the MIME type of the data, and the third element is the actual base64 encoded data. Then I'm creating a buffer from the base64 encoded data. The buffer class in node.js is used to work with binary data. The last line uploads the buffer to Azure Blob Storage using the blob client. The second argument you're seeing here to the upload method is the size of the data to upload, which is the length of the buffer. Now, the only thing that is left to do is send back this URL and also give a status code of 200, which is a success message. And we'll just do that. So we are sending back a status code of 200. We are sending back a body, which has the QR code URL. And that URL is the blob client.url. And I'm also including a header saying that the content type, which is our response, is in JSON response. And this was our try block, as you can see. Now let's code the catch block. So here, we're just catching any errors. and we'll give back a status code of 500, which means an internal server error code. And the body for the response will be whatever the error message is. So we'll save that, and that will give us our Azure function that generates a QR code for a provided URL, either in the query or in the body of the GET request. Now, in order to run this function locally, let's expand our integrated terminal here. Make sure we are in the right directory, which is the QR code generator. Before we can start this function, I forgot one thing, and that is the connection string to the Azure storage account. So you can save that connection string in the local.settings.json, which is this file. And we named our connection string as storage underscore connection underscore string. So I'll copy that, paste that here, and then I'll go to my storage account, go to access keys on the left-hand side, and I'll not show this on the screen, but I'll copy this over to my local settings. So I have copied the connection string to local.settings.json, and now we have already made sure that we are in the right directory where our Azure functions live. We can test our function locally by typing func. And as you can see, it'll give us a URL on the port 7071 and also our HTTP trigger endpoint, which is generate QR code. So let's copy this. I'll be using Postman extension, which is a VS Code extension. You could use any API tools that you use to make GET requests. I'll click on new HTTP request, bring down my terminal for better visibility, and type in the URL, which is the localhost URL we just got from the terminal. For the query parameters, we know that we have to specify a URL. So I'll go with my rishabhkumar.com website. There we go. I'll hit send. Now we should get back an HTTP status code of 200, which is okay. And if we look at the response, which should be at the bottom here, you can see we are getting a JSON response with a URL, which looks like an Azure storage URL. And you can also look at the terminal output of our function running. So you can see there are no errors, right? So if we copy that URL, which we got in the response, it should lead us to a PNG file. And you can see it downloaded it. So if I click open, it should be a QR code to rishabhkumar.com, and I'm back. So I'm pretty sure if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to rishabhkumar.com. And yeah, so our Azure function to generate a QR code for a given URL is working. So we have a local working API. Now the challenge is we have to deploy this to Azure, which is pretty easy, I'm not gonna lie. But before we do that, I wanna make sure everything is committed to GitHub. So I'll create a GitHub repository, we'll name it Azure QR Code, and deploy all of our function code there, which is, a good practice. So I'll recommend you to store your code in your GitHub repository and also document it well, as I'll do that too. I'll create a README and have an architecture diagram for my API here. But yeah, now moving on to how to deploy this to Azure. Again, I'll be using the Azure Functions core tools, which will allow us to publish this or deploy this to Azure using our CLI. Before I do that, we'll have to create a function app within our Azure account. So in order to do that, let me hop over to my Azure portal and let's create a function app. If you cannot see this on your create resource screen, you can search it in the services. So I'll click on create. I'll be using my QR code generator resource group where we created the storage account and the correct subscription. For the function app name, let's go with Azure-QR-code. Hopefully it's not taken. Awesome. And here it'll ask if you want to deploy code or container. In our case, it's code. For the runtime, it's node.js. For the version, let's go with 18. And let's keep the region to East US, or pick whatever region is closer to you. For me, it's East US. The operating system, I'm going to opt for Linux. And again, your region might reload here if Linux is not available within a certain region. For the consumption plan, I recommend going the serverless route since this is, a side project that we are building. We'll click next, and this will bring us to storage. So we need to link our Azure function to a general purpose Azure storage account, and it will create that for us. So that's good. For networking, we'll enable public access since we left the authentication level to be anonymous because we want the public to use this. For application insights, it's totally up to you. I usually have them enabled, so you can either click yes or no. Basically, it gives you insights about how your function is being used. For the deployment, continuous deployment. So here you can choose if you have already pushed your Azure function to a GitHub repository, you can choose that and it will create a GitHub action that will do the CI/CD for you. So anytime you make changes to your Azure function locally and push them to GitHub, those changes will be deployed automatically using this GitHub action, which can be set right in the portal, which is awesome. For now, I'll leave it disabled because I want to show you how you can do it via the CLI. And then you can add tags to your resource, which also I highly recommend. So maybe a project type and then whatever the value is. We'll click on review and create, and then click on create. So this will create our function app. So as you can see, the deployment is in progress and it might take 1 to 2 minutes. So we'll wait. Okay. So the deployment succeeded, and you can see that we have our function app ready. So as you can see, the Azure QR code has been deployed, but if you look at functions, there are none. So this is where we'll push our local code through the Azure Functions core tools. Open your VS Code, and let's stop the locally running function here. Let me expand my integrated terminal here. And the command to push our locally created Azure function is func space Azure space function app space publish and whatever the name of the function app is in the Azure portal. So in my case, it's Azure-QR-code. Hit enter and make sure you are in your functions directory, which in my case is the QR code generator directory, right? So I'm running this command within that directory, and you can see that the function app deployment has started. It's uploading package, and the upload completed successfully. And now the deployment has completed. So if we go back to the Azure portal here and click on refresh, we should see something under the function section. And there we go. So we have our generate QR code HTTP trigger, which we just deployed from our local machine. Before you can test this HTTP trigger, the last thing to do is remember, we still have to add that environment variable of our storage connection string. Remember, we were storing that in the local settings.json. So I want you to copy that and go into your Azure portal. Under configuration, you should be able to add an application setting. So if you click on new application setting, add your storage underscore connection underscore string value here. And as you can see, I've already added mine, and then click on save. And it'll say that your app may restart because you have made changes to the settings. Okay, so our app is updated. Now you can go back to the overview screen, click on the generate QR code HTTP trigger, and you should be able to get the function URL. So copy that, go back to our VS Code, and I had my Postman extension here. So instead of using the local host, we'll be using the Azure function that has been deployed to the cloud. So for the parameter, again, we'll have to send a URL. So this time, let's go with some other URL, and which is my blog URL, which is blog.rishabhkumar.com. Let's hit send. And as you can see, we got a 200 OK message, and the QR code URL is for blog.rishabhkumar.com.png. Let's go to this URL, and it will download another PNG file, which I'm pretty sure is my blog site So if you want to visit my blog site, you can scan this QR code. But hey, our Azure function is working. It's acting as an API to generate QR codes by sending HTTP requests. So what I want to do next is to create a front end in Next.js because I've been exploring Next.js since mid last year and I want to get better at it. So I want to create a front end which utilizes this API, which is Azure Functions, to generate these QR codes. And also, I want to integrate Terraform. So to launch all of the resources, how you saw that, we had to create the storage account, which I didn't show because, it's just ClickOps, like I showed you how to create an Azure Function app. So I want to utilize Terraform to deploy those resources. And I also want to create a front end in Next.js. But I know the video will get lengthy, so let me go ahead and do that, and I'll share the progress with you. Okay, so I built the front end in Next.js, and this is the index page. So I'm using Axios to do the GET request to our Azure function endpoint, and I'm passing the URL, and I'll show you the front end. But basically, I've created a form where you can submit the URL, and there's a button which basically sends this GET request. And simple styles at the bottom of the page.js. And I have the dev server running. So if you go to localhost 3000, you can see this is the UI. So you have the QR code generator and you can add any URL. So https example.com. And if I click on generate QR code, it should display a QR code right at the bottom, but something is not working. So let's do an inspect and go to the console, and we are getting a course error. So the infamous course error. No access control allow region. So localhost 3000 is not allowed to make the request to our Azure function. There's a fix. So if you go to your portal and go to your function, if you scroll down, you'll see course on the left-hand side, and you can add allowed regions. So let's add HTTP localhost. Again, don't do this for any of the production apps. Since I want to show you how my front end looks, I'll add this and remove it later because then, people can make too many requests to your function by running apps locally, and you don't want that. So only add the trusted domains to cores. So now that we have added localhost 3000, let's do a generate QR code again. And there you go. The request succeeded. And now you have a QR code, which is for example.com, not what you'll be using it for, but hey, it works, which is awesome. So I can also go over the code where, it displays. So this is how it displays the image. So image source is set to the QR code URL, which we get back as the response in our JSON when we do a GET request. Condition that, we get a response and a 200 OK message. So yeah, that is the front end. Also, the next step would be to write the Terraform code so that all of the infrastructure is in place, which I haven't done yet because I was trying to figure out the front end. But another thing I've done is a good README file. So if I open preview, I've added an architecture diagram. So right now I haven't added the front end part of it because I haven't really hosted the next app. So maybe I'll use static web apps in Azure and then this diagram will change. But for now, you're a user, you can do a GET request to the Azure function with a URL. That QR code function will generate the QR code and save it in blob storage, and will also return the status code of 200 via the Azure function with the blob storage URL for the QR code. So basically that is how our API works. I hope you enjoyed this video, and comment down if you're looking for more project ideas, but I think this was a solid one because you have a serverless technology Azure functions which you're using to build an API that creates QR code, and you are using Azure storage to store them. But on top of that, you can have a front-end app which will consume your API, and you can make use of the static web apps to host your front end then, but also you can have CI/CD, right? Which is also I figured out. So if you go to the README, right, you can see on the top, the build and deploy of Node.js project is passing. So anytime I make a change to the Azure function here, which is the QR code generator, it'll be deployed automatically to the Azure Functions app. So cover CI/CD and then also IAC, in which you can use Terraform to deploy all the necessary infrastructure when you're building out this project. So I hope this video was helpful. In order to support this channel, make sure you like and comment and also subscribe to the channel, because I keep creating helpful cloud and DevOps content. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.